G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Daniel. This has been taken from Dr. Al Fruchtenbaum's commentary on the Book of Daniel. He's the head of RL Ministries worldwide. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so we're into session 17 of the Book of Daniel. We're going to cover from chapter 9, verse 27 down to chapter 10, verse 10. Last session we finished off, we're in the times known as the 77s or the 70 weeks prophecy. It's a 490-year period. So far, we've covered the first 69 sevens or weeks of years. That's 483 years. And this started with the decree of Cyrus to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. And this was after the exiles were able to go back into their land. The first 7 weeks was the 49 years, and that was to rebuild Jerusalem. That was then followed straight away by the 62 sevens or the 434 years, giving us a total of 483 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until the coming of the Messiah. So between the first 69 weeks and the 70th week, three things had to happen. Now, actually, this is where we are today. We are between the 69th and 70th week, and these things are happening as we do. First of all, we saw that the Messiah had to be cut off or killed. This was around 35 years after his birth in AD 30. That's when he was killed in AD 30. After Messiah was cut off, then came the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And then this happened in AD 70, which was 40 years after his crucifixion. Daniel then prophesied that the end of Jerusalem would be with a flood, meaning a military invasion. Now, this was led by Vespasian and Titus, Romans. And then for the remainder of the time between the 69th week and the 70th week, Daniel prophesied that the land would be characterized by wars, and we see that happening. We've seen it happening. It's happening even today. We're now going to pick up in the 70th week, which is the last 7 years. We know it as the 7 years of the Great Tribulation. Here we go. Now, back in verse 25, Gabriel revealed that the 77s would be divided into two parts, 7 weeks, 62 weeks. The passage said nothing about the last and final week or the 7 of the 77s. Verse 27 now gives us this information. Here we go, verse 27. He shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And upon the wing of abominations shall come one that makes desolate, and even unto the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. Now, third subdivision of the 77s concerns the one remaining week, which in keeping with the Hebrew meaning for weeks is Shavuot. It is better to speak of 1 7 or a total of 7 years. Now, these 7 years are the same 7 years of the Great Tribulation. The period is subdivided into two equal parts, and both Daniel and Revelation use different terms. That's the book of Revelation. We have each being exactly 1260 days, or 42 months. Remember, a Jewish month is 30 days. Or also sometimes you'll see a time, times, and half a time, all of which are equivalent to 3.5 years. So the period is labeled in these various different ways. But all three variations means the same. They're all equivalent to 3.5 years. So there is this one 7-year period left to run, the 7 years of the tribulation, which are subdivided into two equal units of 3.5 years each. Sometimes it speaks of the 3.5 years, and sometimes the second 3.5 years. Just determine the context tells you what it is. Okay, now, scriptures reveal three main purposes for the tribulation. The first one is to end wickedness and destroy the wicked. Now, we can find that in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 9, and Isaiah 24, verses 19 to 20. And then the second purpose is to bring about a worldwide revival. And we find it in Matthew 24, 4, and Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 to 17. And then the third reason is to break the stubborn will of the Jewish people. And that's found, that will be found when we get to Daniel chapter 12, verses 5 to 7. So they're the three main purposes of the tribulation. Now, since there has been a break of time, when the prophetic time clock in relation to Israel was stopped at the end of the 69-7, remember that the end of the 69-7 was when Messiah came onto the scene. When will the 70th 7 then begin? What is the event or the sign which will start the clock ticking away once again? What's the sign by which we can know that the 70th 7 has begun? We find it in verse 27. We have one event that started the whole process off, and that was the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, right? So what will be the starting point now of this final 7? The answer is given in verse 27. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. That is the starting point of the 70th 7. The pronoun he, that shall make a covenant, refers back to its nearest antecedent, which we find in verse 26, the prince that shall come. So in other words, the prince that shall come of verse 26 and the he who makes the covenant in verse 27 are one and the same individual. Both of them refer to the one we know now as the Antichrist, who we saw back in Daniel 7 is the final world ruler of the times of the Gentiles. This man, he's going to make a firm covenant. Now, the phrase to make firm means he will impose a very strong covenant containing strong guarantees. So what does that mean? It means that he's going to have the authority to do this because of his power. So, starting point of these last 7 years, which will begin the Great Tribulation, is the signing of a 7-year covenant between Israel and the one known as the Antichrist. Now, they won't know it's the Antichrist when they sign it, but he will be the Antichrist. It's not going to be the rapture of the church that will begin the tribulation. Nowhere in Scripture are we told that. The rapture will come sometime before the tribulation begins. It could be just before, it could be many years before. We don't know when before the tribulation will happen. But we do know that the rapture is not the event which begins the tribulation. The event which starts these last 7 years ticking away is the forcing or the confirming or the imposition of a firm or strong covenant between the Antichrist and Israel. All right. Furthermore, verse 27 says, this covenant is made with many. It's not made with all, because there will be a segment of the Jewish people who will refuse to have anything to do with it. But it's going to be made with the majority, which would have to include the Israeli leadership. The text should not read merely, he shall make a firm covenant with many. But in the Hebrew text, it reads with the many. It has a definite article. It's the many. Yes, I have it there on the slide. So this refers to a specific segment of the Jewish population. And in this case, the many refers to the Jewish leadership of Israel who are empowered to sign covenants of this nature. Now, Isaiah 28, verses 14 to 22, shows that this expression, the many, refers to the leadership of Israel empowered to sign covenants like this one. So specifically, the starting point of the 70th 7 is when there is the signing of a 7-year covenant between the Antichrist and the leadership of Israel. And the duration of it, he says, is for 1 week. That is 7 years. Two things about this phrase. First, the signing of this covenant begins these last 7 years ticking away, and it is made to last for only the 7 years. In other words, contained within the covenant is a time period. It's to be a covenant that will last for the duration of 7 years and no more. So the Jewish leaders signed this covenant with the intention of terminating it at the end of this 7-year period. It is also a covenant in that it begins the last 7 years, the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy. Now, Daniel 9:27 does not reveal if the Antichrist will coerce or force Israel to sign this covenant. All we do know is that the Jewish leadership will sign this covenant for 7 years with this person we know now as the Antichrist. Now, one question has to be answered is whether the 70th 7 must immediately follow the 69 sevens of verses 25 and 26. The answer is no, it does not. If the events of verse 27 follow all the specifics of verse 26, then the covenant mentioned in verse 27 would have been fulfilled after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Yet historically, Israel has not signed such a covenant. Also, the Messiah did not achieve all 6 goals which we saw back in verse 24 at his first coming. For example, vision and prophecy were not sealed up. Therefore, it makes sense that this gap extends all the way to the events that will ultimately lead to his second coming. Also, Messiah views the abomination of desolation, mentioned in one of the following sections of verse 27, as a future event associated with his second coming. That's correlated in Matthew 24, verse 15. Matthew 24, 15. There it is on your screen. All right. But then this verse says that in the midst of the week, or better, in the middle of the 7 years, midpoint of these 7 years, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Now, so here we go. At the midpoint of that last 7-year period, at the end of the first 3.5 years, this covenant, which was made between this person, the Antichrist, and Israeli leadership, which was intended to last for 7 years, is going to be broken. He won't keep his word. So when the Antichrist breaks this covenant with the many of the people of Israel, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. The real way they will know that the covenant has been broken is when there will come a forced cessation of the new Jewish sacrificial system. So, because of what Antiochus Epiphanes did historically, that was back in Daniel chapter 8, we looked at that. Remember, he was a type of what the Antichrist will do in prophecy. The events in Daniel 9:27 are also elaborated upon in Revelation 11, verses 1 to 2. Now, what we should note here from this verse 27 is that by the middle of the tribulation, by the midpoint of the tribulation, the Jewish temple will have been rebuilt and would be fully functioning. So that leads to one of two conclusions. Since the Jewish temple must be rebuilt before the middle of the tribulation, it'll have to be done either before the tribulation starts, or it may be rebuilt during the first half of the tribulation. We don't have enough information to go beyond that. But we can see that by the middle of the tribulation, it will have to be standing and operating long enough for it to be recognized as the Jewish temple. So that midway during the 7-year period, there is to be a forced cessation of its sacrificial system. Now, then it says, upon the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate. Now, in the expression here, upon the wing of abominations, the word wing refers to the pinnacle of the temple. This is the same place. Remember, Jesus was tempted. The devil tempted Jesus to throw himself down from the pinnacle here. It's upon that pinnacle where the abomination will occur. Now, the word also means an overspreading influence. This is what the wing means. It means an overspreading influence because it will be upon this pinnacle in the temple compound that the worship of the Antichrist will indeed begin. Now, we already saw back in Daniel chapter 8, but this is reiterated by Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 to 4, where Paul describes the Antichrist. He's sitting in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. So, the forced cessation of the sacrificial system is made by the Antichrist. So the Jews will be doing their sacrifices again, because remember, they've rejected Messiah, so they're going back to the old Mosaic system. They'll be doing their sacrifices according to Mosaic law, and then at the midpoint, Antichrist will demand that the people now accept him as God, and he'll stop the sacrificial system, and he'll signify it according to Revelation 13. By now, people have to take the mark of 666. That's in Revelation 13. We see that, verses 16 to 17. Okay. In place of the sacrificial system, then, which the Jews will have inaugurated upon the basis of the Mosaic law, the Antichrist will now demand the setting up of his own image. And he's going to call all men to begin worshipping him as God within the compound and precincts of the Jewish temple. The Hebrew term for abomination is a word called shikutz. It means a detested thing, and it refers to an image or idol. And as we know from other passages, the image of the Antichrist will be set up in the temple compound. And this is further stated in Daniel 12:11 when we get there. You'll see that. Jesus also refers to this in Matthew 24:15. And also Revelation 13 verses 14 to 15 speaks about this as well. These passages points out that once this image is made, it's going to be given life. Revelation 13. So when he comes, the Antichrist makes desolate. What does that mean? Well, the Antichrist is going to cause unprecedented persecutions to fall upon the Jewish people. Because with the breaking of this covenant and the abomination of desolation mentioned here, according to Matthew 24, verses 15 to 22, Matthew 24, 15 to 22, this signals the beginning of the final attempt to destroy all the Jews once and for all. So a massive desolation of the Jewish people will now begin as a result of the breaking of their covenant with the Antichrist and the setting up of his image. Now, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, remember him? We looked at him earlier on. He performed an abomination of desolation. What did he do? He set up an image of Zeus Olympius in the temple compound, according to history. That was the abomination that he set up. But this time, it will not be an image of Zeus Olympius. This is going to be an image of the Antichrist himself. Now, according to rabbinic tradition, this is rabbinic tradition, this is not biblical theology. According to rabbinic tradition, Daniel 9:27 was fulfilled when the second temple was destroyed by the Romans under Titus. That's how they see it. Now, the next phrase, it says, even unto the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. The expression, even unto the full end, refers to the full end of these 77s, specifically the full end of the 70th seven. Hebrew word kala for the word full end means completion or complete destruction, or consumption or annihilation. So to the end or the finish or the completion of the 70th seven, which in turn completes the 77s of the 490-year period. So this is onto the full end. So from the time that the Antichrist breaks this covenant and he causes a forced cessation of the temple rituals in the middle of the tribulation, until these desolations against the Jewish people have run their course, will be for the remainder of the 70th seven, or for 3.5 years. That determined, it says there, the full end, and that determined means that which has been decreed beforehand. This has been decreed by God. So the events of the tribulation have already been predetermined by God. And this is brought out using these very same words in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 23, and Isaiah 28, verse 22. The point of this phrase goes on to mean that the end will be an actual terminal end. It cannot and it will not be allowed to go beyond the time allotted for it. It will finish on that day, in that hour. That will be exactly 7 years to the day, which is precisely 1260 days from the time that the covenant is broken in verse 27. Okay. Now, 1260 days is 3.5 years. Oh, I can't do mathematics this quickly. Now, that is what Jesus means in Matthew 24, verse 22, when he said, and except those days had been shortened. Now, this doesn't mean that the days themselves will be any shorter than 24 hours. That's not what it means. But it means the length of the period of those days will be cut short. Now, the tribulation will be suddenly cut short at the appointed time, because if that was not going to be the case, no one would survive. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened, which means they'll come to an end at that point. That period, excuse me, cannot and will not be permitted to go beyond the time allowed for it by God. The Jews are yet to suffer a terrible time of Holocaust that will last not a minute beyond 1260 days. But during this period, he says, wrath shall be poured out upon the desolate. Again, the word desolate could mean two things. First, it could mean simply desolate, and as such it would refer to the Jews during the second half of the tribulation, in which they're suffering persecution and desolation by this prince that shall come. Or second, the same word could also mean desolator, in which case it would refer to the Antichrist. And if it has this meaning, it would mean that God's wrath will be poured out upon him as the desolator at the second coming of the Messiah, which will be on the very last day of the 70th seven. Yeah, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks this is what is being referred to in light of the flow of the movement of verse 27. The beginning is made with the signing of the covenant, the middle with the breaking of the covenant, and the cessation of the sacrifices, and the setting up of the abomination of desolation and its associated desolation of the Jews. Then the end comes, when God finally pours out his wrath upon the desolator himself, referring to the sudden destruction of the Antichrist at the second coming of Jesus Christ. And this is recorded in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8 to 9. 2 Thessalonians 2, 8 to 9. 2 Thess 2, 8 to 9. Now, there are two possible paraphrases of verse 27 that might help you to better understand the prophecy contained in it. We use the ASV Bible, ASV American Standard Version 1901. On the left-hand side there you see it. Yeah, first paraphrase of chapter 9, verse 27. He shall cause to prevail a covenant with the many for 1 7, but in the middle of the 7 he will cause the sacrifice and the offering to cease. And upon the wing of detestable things desolating, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall wrath be poured out on the desolator. Now, as I said, remember the last phrase can be taken as either wrath upon the desolate, which means the Jews, or the desolator, which means the Antichrist. Second paraphrase, the Antichrist will cause sacrifice and offering to cease, and in their place he shall erect even unto the end, causing an overspreading influence, a detestable statue in the temple, desolating in effect for the duration of the 3.5 year periods in view. All the desolating activity God has determined beforehand would be put out by making it desolate. Take your pick. First one or second one? Okay, we're going to deal with some false conclusions here. Some false conclusions regarding this, and you'll hear, and most of you would have heard some of these. First of all, Because the Jews make a covenant with the Antichrist, that is the reason many will say that the Antichrist has to be Jewish, right? They've made a huge leap of logic here from verse 27 and say that if the Jews make a covenant with the Antichrist, it means that they accept him as the Messiah. Well, nowhere in Scripture does it ever say that the Jews will accept the Antichrist or this person as the Messiah. As a matter of fact, they will not. And the reason for this covenant, as given here in Daniel and elsewhere, especially in Isaiah 28, verse 14 to 22, is for security. Israel enters the covenant for reasons of military security, not because it promises salvation. It has nothing to do with accepting the Antichrist as the Messiah. The Jews have, in the past, the Jews have made covenants with other Gentiles in history, and they've never accepted them as the Messiah. Jews made a covenant with Anwar Sadat of Egypt. No one in Israel believed that Sadat was the Messiah, although they made a covenant with him. Making a covenant is not the same as accepting someone to be the Messiah. The Jews have made covenants with Gentiles before. So that's the first false conclusion. A second false conclusion, and this is in the amillennial school of covenant theology. They claim, this is covenant theology, they claim that the one making the covenant here is Jesus. Why? Because he makes the new covenant. And by the new covenant, he brought the sacrifices as to their meaning by God to an end. And the whole 7 years is now history. So obviously they have to avoid taking these 7 years as literal years. Now, that's false. I'll give you 7 quick reasons why. First of all, this is verse 27. First of all, the he of verse 27 is the same as the prince that shall come in verse 26, which is clearly not the Christ, but it is the Antichrist, because remember, he was not a member of the same people that destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. The he of verse 27 must therefore be the Antichrist. Second, the group that he makes the covenant with is the many, which is used of Israel in places like Isaiah 52:14 and 53:12. Third, in the overall context of Daniel 7, this has already been mentioned in Daniel 7 as part of Israel's times, and half a time. Consistency requires that the same period also refers to the Antichrist in Daniel 9:27 and not to Jesus. Yeah. Fourth, the blasphemous act described in verse 27 is the same one Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4. And Paul clearly is referring to the Antichrist and not to Jesus. Fifth, the last phrase of verse 27, wrath poured out upon the desolate, refers to Israel or to the destruction of the Antichrist at the second coming and not the establishment of the church in first century. And sixth, when Jesus spoke of the abomination of desolation, he made reference to the book of Daniel in Matthew 24:15 to 31. And Jesus puts this abomination of desolation before his own second coming, not shortly after his first coming. And the last one, the 70th seven has to accomplish all 6 purposes that we saw back in chapter 9, verse 24, which have not as yet happened. So, according to the amillennial stream of thought, it is not Jesus. It is the Antichrist. Okay, final vision. Now. The last 3 chapters of the book of Daniel, which is where we are, 10, 11, and 12, constitute one unit of thought, and it comprises Daniel's final vision. So far, Every chapter in the book was a self-contained unit. But with these last 3 chapters, we have a change. Beginning in chapter 10, we have one continuous vision to the end of chapter 12. So this is Daniel's 4th and final vision which he receives. This is where he gets his most detailed vision from. It's a massive sweep of prophecy, beginning with his own time and going right on down onto the second coming, the establishment of the kingdom, and the resurrection of the dead. The prophecy actually begins in chapter 11, verse 2. From verse 2 to verse 35, the prophecies have already been fulfilled so accurately and so exactly that critics of the book of Daniel, who do not believe in predictive prophecy, who do not believe that the Bible can predict future events, insist that Daniel is a fake. And his book was actually written not when it is claimed to have been written during the Babylonian and early Persian period, but many years after the fact. After all, these prophecies have already been fulfilled. That's what the liberals believe. That's the ones who don't believe literally the Bible. But not only are these prophecies very detailed, once they have been fulfilled literally. So this helps in the case against amillennialism, which says that there's no millennial, there's no kingdom. In fact, against all 3 branches of covenant theology that insist that much of prophecy must be interpreted symbolically in relation to the church and not literally in relation to Israel. But if past prophecies have been so literally fulfilled, then unfulfilled prophecies should also be fulfilled in the very same way, literally, not allegorically or symbolically. Okay, we have a man. We have the vision of the man from chapter 10, verse 1 to chapter 11, verse 1. So here, this is a bit of an introduction to the key prophecy of which we're going to find in 11:2 down to 12:4. The vision of the man is, we're going to split it up into 6 portions. First 3 verses of chapter 10 give us the background. Here we go, the background. Chapter 10, verse 1 to 3. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. And the thing was true, even the great warfare, and he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 whole weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine into my mouth. Neither did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Again, Daniel gives us a date in verse 1. This is the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So we are now in the year 536 BC. Daniel is somewhere about 84, 85 years old at this time. 2 years have passed since the events of chapter 9. 2 years. And that happened, chapter 9 happened in the 1st year of Cyrus, or the 1st year, remember, of Darius the Mede. So Daniel had now been in Babylon for a little over 70 years, 7 decades. So in that year, on this day, a thing, meaning a special message, was revealed to Daniel for the last time. He confirms who he is, pointing out that he was also known as Belteshazzar. Again, that was the Babylonian name given to him by, remember, Nebuchadnezzar. And the reason he adds this is because most of the people in the Persian Empire would know him by that name rather than by his Hebrew name, Daniel. He obviously prefers his Hebrew name, but he must let other people know that the Babylonian name by which he's known. So on this day, something was revealed to Daniel, and he points out that the vision he saw was true, meaning it would come to pass. It will be fulfilled. But as we're going to discover, he didn't understand all that he was seeing. Yet he had the full assurance that it would all come to pass, even though he didn't understand it. And this vision had to do with even a great warfare, not in the sense of a one-time war, but a long and strenuous period of trouble, especially for the people of Israel. He understood the thing. This means he understood the basic point of the initial part of the vision in chapter 10, verse 1, that it meant trouble for the Jewish people. But when we get into the closing part of chapter 12, we're going to discover that there were certain elements which he didn't understand, which he'll actually admit in chapter 12, verse 8. It's chapter 12, verse 8. Okay. Occasion of the vision we see in verses 2 to 3. He is undergoing a period of mourning 3 whole weeks. The question is, what was he mourning about? Well, it has been a good 2 years since the decree of Cyrus was issued in chapter 9, and only a very small remnant of the entire Jewish population living in Babylon had chosen to return to the land. In fact, only 49,697 Jews chose to take advantage of it and return. How do we know this? Because it's given to us in Ezra 2, 64 to 67. And Nehemiah also tells us in Nehemiah 7, 66 to 69. So, on the one hand, one reason he may have been mourning for these 3 weeks was because he was noticing that the bulk of his people in Babylon chose not to go back because, well, life in Babylon was too good for the Jews to leave behind and go back to a place where they're going to rebuild. Second problem, according to Ezra 4, verses 1 to 5, was in the land of Israel itself, with the Jews who had returned there. They were facing difficulties and discouragements. Third, the rebuilding of the temple had been stopped. Some had returned and had begun to rebuild it, but now they had actually established and laid the foundations, but now through opposition, the reconstruction of the temple building had been suspended and would remain so for the next 15 years, according to Ezra chapter 4, verse 23 to 24. Ezra 4, 23 to 24. Now, Daniel, also being a government official, he would have been receiving reports of opposition to the rebuilding from surrounding nations. So only a small number of Jews had returned. There were problems in the land. The rebuilding of the temple had been hindered. All of this resulted in Daniel wondering why it had all happened, and it causes him to begin a period of fasting and mourning. Verse 3 tells us how far and to what extent his mourning went. First, he fasted 3 whole weeks, and during that time he says, I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine into my mouth. Second, he did not practice any degree of relaxation. He didn't anoint his body at all with oil for the duration of the entire 3-week period. These 3 weeks, incidentally, included the period of Passover, as we're going to see by the date he gives in verse 4. So this Passover is normally a time of feasting. It's not a time of fasting. But Daniel was so troubled that he even gave up the Passover festivities. Now, the man we see in verses 4 to 6, he receives the vision of the man. And in the 24th day of the first month, as I was by the side of the great river, which is Hiddekel, I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with pure gold of Uphaz. His body also was like the beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as flaming torches, his arms and his feet like unto burnished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. Okay, so here, verse 4, he begins to see the vision, and we're given the occasion in which it happened. It's at the end of that 3-week period of mourning that the vision begins. In verse 4 is a date. It's the 24th day of the first month, which is the month of Nisan. First month of the Jewish calendar is the month of the Passover, which begins on the 14th day of the first month and continues for the next 7 days. So as Daniel fasted for a period of 21 days, it included the whole Passover season, which was usually a time of feasting and rejoicing. First 2 days of the festival of the new moon, according to 1 Samuel 20, verse 18 to 19 and verse 34. And so Daniel did not begin fasting until the 3rd day and continued to fast until the 24th day. So he missed the whole Passover and the unleavened bread celebration. Now, the Torah demanded that the Passover be observed in Jerusalem. So Daniel did not actually break Mosaic law because he wasn't in Jerusalem. He was in Babylon. Now, at that time, Daniel was on a mission of some kind for the government, and he was beside the great river Hiddekel. Now, the name appears only here and in Genesis 2:14. Genesis 2:14. And this is the Akkadian designation of the Tigris River in what is now Iraq. So this time, Daniel is there physically and not merely in a vision as he was with the previous chapters. So while Daniel was standing by the banks of the Tigris, some 20 miles from Babylon, a heavenly messenger appeared to him. Suddenly, in verses 5 to 6, he receives a vision of a man, and he gives us a detailed description. He tells us 7 things about him. He saw a man, first of all, and he was clothed in linen. Now, linen was a symbol of purity. We'll check it out in Revelation 19, verse 8. It was also the kind of clothing worn by the priests of Israel. Exodus 28:42 tells us this. So it also emphasizes a priestly service. Second, his loins were girded with pure gold of Uphaz. So this emphasizes his supernatural character. Being clad in gold like this was a mark of royalty. So this was someone who was of princely rank and office. And this emphasizes his supernatural character. Third, his body also was like the beryl. Now, beryl could also mean topaz or something called chrysolite, which usually represented a degree of health or perfection of health. Fourth, his face as the appearance of lightning. So his face had this sharp brilliances. Such brilliance was typical for the Shekinah glory. We see that in Matthew 17, verse 2, for instance, which means this person was reflecting the Shekinah glory of God. Fifth, his eyes as flaming torches, and this emphasizes discernment and penetrating insight. Revelation 2:18 tells us that. Sixth, his arms and feet were like unto burnished brass. Now, burnished brass is a symbol in the Old Testament for judgment, which means this figure was involved in carrying out judgment as well. Seventh, it says he had a voice like the voice of a multitude, which emphasizes the authority in his speech. This phrase is often used to describe the voices of heaven. Revelation 19:6, for instance. Revelation 19:6 tells us that. Also, including the voice of God, which we see in Ezekiel 4:32. Ezekiel 4:32. Now, having described this individual by these 7 statements, the question is, who is he? Now, some identify him as Jesus because as you're listening to this, you'd think, hang on, that's the description that John saw in Revelation chapter 1, verses 13 to 16. That's exactly what John saw. So many have therefore identified this as a theophany, which is an appearance of the pre-incarnate Son of God. It is true that the description of what this figure is wearing and what Christ is wearing in Revelation 1 is very similar. Yet the likeness is not really exact. However, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks this cannot be Jesus. More likely, it's a high-ranking angel because, as we're going to see, as we proceed to read through this chapter, we're going to discover that in Daniel 10:13, which we won't get there today, this individual had a battle with a leading demon, the prince of Persia. And this individual was actually held back so that he needed help from Michael the archangel. Now, if this was the Messiah, if this was the pre-incarnate Son of God, he wouldn't need any help from Michael. So what we have here then is not the pre-incarnate Christ, but we have a senior, powerful, and high-ranking good angel who has come to fulfill a mission to Daniel as Gabriel had done back in chapter 8 and 9. In verses 7 to 10, we see Daniel's reaction. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. For the men that were with me saw not the vision, but a great quaking fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me. For my comeliness was turned in me into corruption, and I retained no strength. Verse 9 says, Yet heard I the voice of his words. And when I heard the voice of his words, then was I fallen into a deep sleep on my face, with my face toward the ground. And behold, a hand touched me, which set me upon my knees and upon the palms of my hands. So in verse 7, first of all, we see the effect upon those who happened to be with Daniel. He was obviously on a governmental mission because he had an escort with him. Now, remember, he wasn't transported there this time in the vision, as he had been in chapter 8. He actually was by the Tigris River, and he had a royal escort with him. Only Daniel actually saw the appearance of the man in the vision, but it was a real appearance according to verses 16 to 19. None of the men who were there with Daniel actually saw the vision, but they knew something unusual was going on because a great quaking fell upon them. They became greatly afraid and fled to hide themselves. Very similar to the experience of Paul on the Damascus Road in Acts 9, 3-7. Remember, he too saw a vision. He had men with him, but only Paul saw the vision. The other men didn't see anything, but they were aware that something strange is going on. So Daniel's attendants flee, but Daniel stands his ground. Verse 8 to 9, he describes the actual effects on him. First, we're told that he was left alone. Why? Because the others had run away. Second, he saw this great vision. Word for vision here is appearance. It's not the normal word for vision. What he saw was a real appearance physically in the form of a man. Third, as he watched this vision, he was overcome with weakness. It says, there remained no strength in me. Fourth, my comeliness was turned in me into corruption. This last phrase here means that his normally mild demeanor suddenly began to shake to the point where he could have actually corrupted and died. It emphasizes that something internal had turned fearful in him. And then fifth, he says, I retained no strength. As we're going to see, he lost his ability to stand. And sixth, yet I heard the voice of his words. So when he started to hear the voice of this angel, seventh, he suddenly fell into a deep sleep. The effect on him was to make him lose consciousness. He fainted. If he lost consciousness, he didn't fall backwards, but he fell forward with his face to the ground. He had this same experience, remember, with Gabriel back in chapter 8, verses 17 to 18 and verse 27. And now it happens again in this particular passage. In verse 10, the angel strengthens him. And behold, a hand touched me. This is the first of 3 times this angel will need to touch Daniel in order to give him strength. Remember, the guy is 84, 85 years old. So not only is he, and also he's seeing an angel. So not only is he seeing a vision that is extremely frightening to him, Daniel, as I said, is in his 80s and rather aged at this point, and so everything is working against him. But this is the first time the angel touches him, and he gives him renewed strength, and it says he set me upon my knees and upon the palms of my hands. So he's down now on all fours, as an animal would be. He's on all fours. And now he's able to rise up on his knees, but his palms were still on the ground, and he was here in a kneeling position. Now this is where we're going to leave it for this session, because the next session we have a stoush in the angelic realm. Okay. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong. Remember, these will be up on the Ariel Ministries Australia YouTube website, YouTube station, where we have all these things recorded. Thanks for coming along.